Welcome and thanks for joining me today. This is episode 41 of the Water Entrepreneur Podcast, and I'm your host, Paul Gagliardo. And today I'm excited to have as my guest Sue Mecham, co-founder, CEO, and president of Nala Systems, and her mother, Judy. Hi, guys. Thanks for being water entrepreneurs and appearing on the show today.
Hello. Hi. Thank you so much.
So, a few years after I moved to San Diego back in the late 70s from New York, my father asked me if I wanted to take over his architecture and construction business. And I had to respectfully decline, mainly because I didn't want to move back to New York. I really liked it here in San Diego. I've interviewed startup founders who work with their brother, two who've worked with their father, but this is the first time I've interviewed somebody who works with her mom. So Sue, tell me, she is sitting right next to you, but tell me how that came about and how you find it working closely with your mom on technical issues.
Well, that came about because I followed my mother into her career. So she was my mentor, and she got a PhD in polymer science. And as a teenager, I watched her career developing, and I thought, hey, that looks like a good plan. So I decided as a high school senior that I was going to get my PhD in polymer chemistry, and I did. So I kind of followed her through that career path to a certain extent. And I enjoyed working with her every opportunity I got. She pursued academics. I went into industry and then went back to academics. But all through that, conversations around the dinner table about polymer chemistry were pretty common. So that was kind of how that started out. And then later in our careers, I was looking to start a company, and she was looking to retire from the university. And I said, hey, let's start a company. And yeah, so she did. So but that's how we got into this together. And I think we're doing exactly what we were meant to do. I think that's something based in polymers and something that has a big impact, and that's really important. So we're excited to be doing this together.
So Judy, what was your interest in polymer chemistry back in the day? How did you get started in it?
Oh, well, I was originally interested in fabrics. I was, thinking about homemaking and things like that. And then I actually went to an organic chemistry class one day, and I spent the next 9 years studying it. Uh, I thought, my, this is great. You can make things that have a combination of properties that you want, and you can just think up the set of properties and you can make them. So we went from there.
Really interesting. So back in the 90s, when I was working more exclusively in the membrane business, I was working on a project to make sewage directly into drinking water. So we had a lot of membrane systems that unit processes that we were working with. I recall that at that point in time, there hadn't really been any new reverse osmosis formulations been developed in the recent past. Some people were touting ceramic membranes, but nothing yet had come about that. So really, I wanted to talk to you guys about the history of reverse osmosis membranes. But I want to first start out. Isn't it true that reverse osmosis is kind of a misnomer? Isn't it just osmosis when you're looking at reverse osmosis membranes? Is that true, or am I wrong?
Do you want to take that one?
I think it's an interesting name. If you had just reverse osmosis and you have a salt water system on one side of a membrane and plain water on the other, or pure water on the other, the pure water side is going to flow towards the salt water. And to do what we want to do, what we basically do is take a saltwater solution and force it through a membrane under pressure. And the contaminants in the water get filtered out and you get fresh water on the other side. So it's absolutely the reverse of osmosis, and that's what they called it.
Okay, just I always
I don't
was,
know if I don't know if it's a misnomer, but it's an interesting way to to look at it. It really is the reverse of osmosis.
okay, okay. Well then, as always, I learn something new every day. So can you just explain maybe just the fundamentals of, you did a little bit about how reverse osmosis works, and I did want to ask a little bit about your familiarity with the Yale School of Engineering and Applied Science research that makes the argument that the accepted theory of how RO membranes work is fundamentally wrong. I'm not a polymer chemist. I'm not an expert in membranes and water transport, but maybe you can just give the listeners the basic concept of how an RO membrane works and what it really does, what it removes, and all those kinds of things.
Do you want to take a crack at that, or shall I?
Either way, I can go this time. I'll let her add on to this. She is the professor.
Use the snake. Use the snakes.
Okay. Okay. So if you look at reverse osmosis membranes are dense membranes. So as opposed to porous membranes. So if you think of a porous membranes, it has actual, defined pores or holes in it that things can pass through. That's what we would call a porous membrane. Reverse osmosis are what we would call a dense membrane, which means you have a solid piece of plastic, essentially is what it is, with no apparent holes in it. And so the way that it's been theorized that for a long time that water transports through that solid material is that it goes through what's called a solution diffusion mechanism, where the water molecule or any molecule has to absorb onto the surface of the polymer itself, and so basically engage with the polymer material, the molecules of the polymer, and then it has to diffuse through that passageway, so the bulk of it. So it's a surface absorption, a bulk diffusion, and then a surface desorption on the other side. So that's been the mechanism. And so it's been theorized that diffusion takes place through the free volume that's in the polymer. So the free volume of the polymer. So if you think of polymer molecules, they're very, very long molecules. They're tangled up. And that's what gives polymers mechanical properties, is that tangling of those molecules. But depending on the chemical nature of the polymer, primarily, is how those molecules distribute themselves and what type of free volume is created between those polymer chains. And that's where the water can get through, is through those. So that's been the original kind of description of how it works in terms of how the water gets through the material. I'm not a transport, engineer in terms of that transport, but I did read that paper because there was a lot of excitement about that paper coming out. It claims a different theory for how the water passes through, but it's somewhat different, but same general concept in that the water has to pass through the membrane and through the polymer material. They're defining pores as what I see as free volume. So it's hard to tell exactly how different this is, except that I think that one of the big differences was that they were saying that the water transported in packets versus being a constant process, and that had to do with the pressure distribution across that dense membrane. That there was actually not constant pressure across the membrane. That pressure had a pressure drop across the membrane, and so that you had different pressures, and so that impacted the flow. It was very complicated. I'm really not sure how it will impact. I don't think it will impact what we're doing and how we use reverse osmosis membranes. I think the concept is, if we have a different theory, would we create a different membrane structure? I think this is still early days in terms of that, because that paper really just came out, but there may be some utility in that direction.
Judy, do you want to add anything?
Well, maybe I should just say something about the concept of what free volume is in a polymer. So Sue said that polymers have a very long aspect length and they get tangled up. And many people describe polymers, in terms of an analogy as being like spaghetti. That's not right. What it is snakes, and snakes move. And hopefully your spaghetti doesn't. And so when you have a tangled up bunch of snakes, you have some spaces in between them. And as those snakes move, those spaces move. And so a free volume, the way it's described is that you have water passing through to one point, and then the snakes move, and the free volume opens up ahead of it, and it progresses like a according to the motion of the snakes. And it doesn't have to invoke pores. There's no permanent holes in these. There's no evidence of permanent pores that I know of. But that is the basic idea of how we think this water transports through a membrane. Now, it may be packets if you're a modeler, and I'm not. But it's the idea of having no permanent pores and the idea of having movable free space so that the water can transport through that free space.
That's interesting, because I remember when we were looking at microfiltration and ultrafiltration, we always talked about pore size. But when we started talking about reverse osmosis, we talked about molecular weight cutoff. And I never really understood maybe the nuanced difference between the two things, but maybe you kind of sort of just described it to me. So I think that was useful. Are you guys familiar with, I know this isn't polymer chemistry, but aquaporeans, and how, because that is more, the movement of water through cell walls, and that to me sounds more like a packet diffusion or a packet movement mechanism, or individual water molecules, I guess, when you get right down to it from the cell wall perspective. So I know it's not your particular area, but I was always fascinated by if you could actually line up those aquaporeons and packet them very nicely, you would have a great membrane, right? But no one's been able to figure out how to get the soldiers to line up, like those Chinese soldiers, the clay Chinese soldiers that, that were buried. But I always, that was one of my, well, that still is one of my things that I would love to see somebody create that, membrane product.
It's not difficult to get the polymers to line up in layers parallel to the surface. But what you need for what you're talking about is to line them up perpendicular to the surface. And that can be done on a very small laboratory scale. But I've never seen anyone be able to really do it well on a commercial scale.
That's my experience as well. So when were RO membranes kind of first developed? Was it the 50s with cellulose acetate membranes? Is that the kind of the genesis of RO membranes?
Do you want to start?
Yeah, I think there was a lot of study, and again, I'm not a historian, but we have looked into this. I think there was a lot of effort to take advantage of reverse osmosis. The concept of reverse osmosis is very, very old. The idea of, could you do this using a membrane-based process? And so the concept of reverse osmosis came way before we actually had a material that could do reverse osmosis, or a system that could actually do reverse osmosis. And that was something that people were working on, is how do you develop a membrane that can be, a functional, relevant reverse osmosis membrane and system. And so, there were some researchers at UCLA that Loeb and Surirajan are well known to have developed the cellulose acetate membrane, and they developed that in a form. They created the phase inversion process to create a cellulose acetate asymmetric membrane where you had a let me step back for just a minute. One of the things that you need in a membrane is it has to be strong enough to resist pressure that needs to be applied to put the water through. You've got to overcome the osmotic pressure with pressure to force the water through. So the membrane material has to be strong enough, and it has to be dense, because you can't have pores, because those pores are going to be bigger than most things like salt that you're trying to push through. So you've got to have a dense membrane. And so in order to have good diffusion characteristics, in order to how far it has to travel through that membrane, you need that membrane to be really, really thin, right? And so that was part of the aspect, is what material do you use that's going to be strong enough, and how do you make it thin enough to make this relevant on a time scale that's useful. And so the way they came up with was to make this asymmetric membrane. And what that means is they created a porous structure that had some thickness to it. They gave it mechanical support, but then they put a very, very thin, solid layer on top, or dense skin on top. And so they created this using a cellulose triacetate material, and they could, affect the hydrophilicity by controlling the amount of functionalization and things like that. But it was really the formation of that asymmetric structure using the phase inversion process that was key to developing that first reverse osmosis membrane. So that was kind of the first material that was applied for reverse osmosis in a membrane form. But then they had to, in order to be able to get enough water through it, they had to have a really high square footage area of membrane material. And so how do you do that in a functional way? And so, not long after that, there was an invention, and somebody's going to have to tell me the name because I can't remember the name, but they invented the spiral wound construction, and that really we're still used today. And that was the first form that the cellulose acetate became functional. They used it in a different form, like a plate and frame form first. But the spiral wound's what made it really potentially commercially relevant to be able to get enough material and enough square footage into that space. And so those were two of the really early inventions with reverse osmosis membranes that said, hey, you know what, we can do something with this. And they were able to do some things with cellulose acetate, but they weren't able to do what they really wanted to do, which was seawater desalination. They could do brackish water desalination with these membranes, but seawater was still a little far off because they couldn't get the salt rejection that they needed for seawater desalination. They'd have to do it multiple times, and that became less desirable in terms of applicability.
And so,
yeah, go ahead.
Well, so what was the next kind of generation or iteration that, was it polysulfone, polyamide, what was the next formulation that allowed seawater desalination to become viable?
Do you want to talk about this?
All right.
You've looked at more of the background history, the background technical stuff, at least.
Well, they knew how to make the so-called tri-layer thin film composite, and the tri-layer thin film composite had a fabric, probably non-woven backing, and then it had a porous construction, as Sue described, with very small pores on top, so that you could actually coat a layer on top, and then they had the top and that was for mechanical support, and then they had a top layer that was the barrier layer for the salt. A couple of things happened in I'd say the late 70s to early 80s. People were working at that time actually with sulfonated sulfones, and also a group that originated from some of the government labs, developed film tech. And film tech was the first that created the first of the aromatic polyamide membranes, which are still used today for seawater desalination. And at that time, as Sue said, the big interest was in seawater desalination because most of the water on this planet is seawater, and there was a huge opportunity market-wise there. They weren't as interested at that time in brackish water desalination. It hadn't really matured to the point where they realized how important that would be. The polyamide membranes that were developed at FilmTech were made in situ, as I'll call it, and that was a very clever technique. In my opinion, it was a very clever technique, not because they were easy to make, but because they had what I would call a self-healing process in them. So the thing is you layer one monomer onto the porous support, and then you run the second monomer in a immiscible solution over the top. And where they come together, the polymer film precipitates. And if there's a hole in it, the still there? Okay. And that is still used today. That basic chemistry is still used today, the interfacial polymerization. And soon after, by the way, Dow Chemical bought FilmTech, and they really developed the systems for reverse osmosis. FilmTech was a membrane company, and Dow really developed the systems that were needed to go with that,
including a lot of the pretreatments
and an awful lot of pretreatments and post-treatments, frankly. The polysulfones were developed about the same time. The people at what was then Union Carbide in Bound Brook, New Jersey, developed the polysulfones, and not as a membrane, but as a polymer. And they realized at that time that if you sulfonated the polysulfone, you would have a material that was very strong and very hydrophilic, and that was coatable as a thin film. And so they knew that at the time. The problem with that membrane was that the materials weren't really available. Membrane companies don't make polymers in general. And so on a large scale, the membranes were not really available. And the people at Union Carbide were making them in a way that they could never get the reproducibility of the polymer right, and they didn't pursue it. So long story short, Albany International really developed the polysulfones into a hollow fiber membrane. And then Millipore bought the rights to that, and they actually commercialized a high flux sulfonated polysulfone membrane in the 80s. But that membrane was more suited for brackish water than for seawater. And as I said, the market was all in seawater at that time. And so they had trouble marketing it. And it was commercial, but it didn't quite make it. Then later on, 30 years later, Jim McGrath at Virginia Tech developed a better way of making the polysulfonated polysulfones. And he was a member of that first Union Carbide group that had trouble making it originally. So he knew what the problems were. And that was very successful in terms of fuel cell membranes. But he really started working in water desalination membranes but not soon enough before he passed away. And that's where we took over. And so we really perfected his way of making it, changed the monomers a bit, and that takes us to where we are today.
So it seems like there's really two big steps. One is the materials, but also it seems like as important as the manufacturing process is almost
Mhm.
in some ways more, I don't want to say more important, but as important as the materials that you're using. You know, to be able to make a viable commercial product.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's right. And you know, when we started Nala, we looked around and we said, okay, so what new membranes have come into the market? Not a lot of new membranes, certainly not in reverse osmosis for a really long time. Well, why? Right. So there have been lots of startups that have started these, you know, had said, hey, we've got this fantastic membrane material, you know, it's going to be great. And you know, they raised all kinds of money, and then they figured out that they couldn't make it at large scale. You know, they couldn't make it on a really commercially relevant scale. And so that's been a challenge for membranes. And so we really looked at that as a big barrier to entry for a new membrane. And so we tackled that from the very beginning. Was okay, so let's say we do want to make this material into a membrane. How are we going to make it? How are we going to manufacture this into that thin, tough film? And so that was really very much a part of our first conversations, because yes, you're absolutely right. The manufacturing process is key. I mean, really, I've worked in a lot of different polymer fields, and it really holds true quite consistently that the performance of the product that's made out of that polymer is going to be a function of the polymer material that's used, the design of the product itself, and the process that's used to make it. All three of those factors are what control that product performance. And so you've got to keep all of those into, you know, really take all of those into account when you're developing the concept for a new product.
And I would say too, if I can say one more thing, the interfacial process for making the polyamides, it's the process that was so clever.
Yeah.
The membranes that we make are made much more like gas separation membranes are made. And those are commercial on large scales, a lot of them. But we had to do it with different materials to make it useful for water.
And that's why we had to use a different process.
But we knew that basic process was available to us.
We also knew that we were doing something, you know, very similar to what Millipore had done back in the 1980s. And so, you know, people ask us, well, you know, do you really think you can do it? I just pointed that. I'm like, yeah, I think we can do it. They did it. I think we can do it.
They did it 40 years ago. So
Exactly.
so is the market now bigger on the seawater side or on the brackish water side or on the recycled water side for that, which is, I guess, brackish water, kind of same thing. But where do you see the big market, you know, kind of coming forward these days?
I think the market is very different today than it was, you know, when the film tech product came out, you know, because when the film tech membrane came out, that really dominates the market right now for reverse osmosis just across the board. There wasn't a big market for reverse osmosis. There weren't a lot of systems. There weren't a lot of, you know, applications. That just wasn't there. That was in development. And so the film tech membrane really was key to developing all of that. And you know, it has developed this market. And so the biggest market is still seawater desalination for reverse osmosis membranes. I've heard something on the order that's probably at least 50% of the market of the reverse osmosis membranes. But you know, there's a lot more brackish water installations now. That's become much more you know, relevant, and it's all over the world, and used quite a bit in the United States as well. You know, seawater desalination isn't used very much in the US. It's used more commonly in the Middle East and in Asia and even in Europe. But brackish water, on the other hand, is huge in the US. And so that's a big change in terms of that market. But the other thing that's happening now is wastewater, you know, wastewater reuse. And so advanced treatment of wastewater. So that would be advanced treatment of treated wastewater to make it potable, right? For making potable water reuse. And then the other, water reuse of industrial wastewater. There's, so many industries today are just, going gangbusters on manufacturing, and they use huge amounts of water in that process. Some of those places are some of those plants are in places like the desert in Arizona, and that's a problem because, as everybody knows, the western part of the United States right now is suffering through a pretty bad drought, and it's not looking like that's going to be changing anytime soon. And so that aspect of trying to provide more water is bringing more opportunities for wastewater reuse, because it back in the day, this is my new thing I'm working on here, but concept of seawater desalination. A lot of people have for years said, hey, we have a global water crisis. We've got water scarcity in all kinds of places. But why? We have so much water. We've got, 97% of the world's water is in the sea. We can desalinate that and everybody's got plenty of water. Okay, that's a great idea. Nice concept. But the problem is that all the places that people need water are not right next to the ocean. A lot of them are really far away from the ocean. And so that water still isn't really very available, right? And so you could desalinate it, but then you have to transport it. And so that's a cost, right? That adds to the cost of that operation. But everywhere you need water, you have wastewater. You've used the water that you had and now it's wasted. And so that's the same water. It's just dirty. You've got to clean it. So if you can clean that water and reuse it, you can solve the world's water problems, because everywhere you have water, everywhere you need water, you have wastewater and you can treat it. And so that's the idea, is to, use reverse osmosis operations for advanced treatment of wastewater in a cost-effective way that can solve those issues. So I really see that as a growing market for reverse osmosis. One of the potential problems with that is that the polyamide thin film composite that's in the market today is it's very prone to fouling. It gets clogged and it gets dirty, and it's very hard to clean without damaging it. And so that doesn't work so great for wastewater that has a lot of stuff in it that gets them fouled and dirty, right? So the idea is that Nala's membranes are stable to oxidants that can be used to eliminate organic fouling as well as biofouling. And so if we've got a stable membrane that's going to be more durable to the process, more durable to cleaning, more longer lasting, that's going to reduce the overall cost of the system. It's going to enable the production of those types of systems and allow that market to expand and actually solve the world's water problems.
So when you talk about, I wanted to ask you about your development, but are we talking about like, chlorine, chloramines, hydrogen peroxide, any kind of oxidant? Is your membrane more amenable to or to use? Does it matter what the oxidant is?
Yeah.
Yes, it does. It does matter. It's still chemistry. But yeah, the way I look at it is, yes, we have to, test specific oxidants. We have done quite a bit of testing with free chlorine and shown, really high stability to free chlorine. So anything, less of an oxidizing agent than that probably is going to be, for the most part, in good shape. There are others that also may be fine, and we're going to be doing some testing. We actually have a grant funded by the NAWI, the National Alliance for Water and Innovation, in conjunction with Orange County Water District and Trussell Technologies, and they're kind of innovators in the potable reuse area. And so we're looking at, could we use a strong oxidant as a pretreatment to run through the entire, advanced oxidation or advanced treatment process in order to be able to eliminate biofouling, reduce fouling, extend, run times and reduce energy of that system. And one of the things we're doing in that project is looking at different oxidants. So, currently they use chloramines. Free chlorine is a much stronger oxidant than chloramines, and so maybe better. But there's a lot of aspects to that process, and so we'll be looking at that one as well as some different oxidants such as peroxides, and that type of thing, to be able to assess their ability to control that fouling, and our membrane's ability to withstand them in terms of durability. So I think that's a key aspect, and I think what's really exciting about that is that for the first time since 1980 or so, we've got a new membrane material that we can start doing some different things with, right? We can start innovating on these systems. How are they designed? How are they run? How can we reduce cost? How can we reduce complexity, extend the lifetime, extend the durability? All of those things can be looked at from a different angle now that we've got a different membrane. And that I think when this comes to realization and we have a product, a full scale commercial product to work with people on, I think they're going to get excited about the opportunity to innovate with these systems, because they're going to be able to do things that they just couldn't do before, and it's going to be game changing.
I'm working up at Orange County Water District now, doing some testing on a piece of monitoring equipment, and the RO skid that we're working on, they're testing hydrogen peroxide and how that affects the fouling rates and all those kinds of things. I mean, I don't have any idea about how it's working, but I just know that the skid we're working on now is using hydrogen peroxide, and interesting. We're looking at a way to monitor organic chemicals that are, you could argue that they're virus-like size-wise, and so we're looking at log removals of virus, as a surrogate. We're seeing some differences in the monitor's results, whether you're using chloramines, whether you're using fluorochlorine, or whether you're using hydrogen peroxide. So there's a lot of very different. I mean, everything changes. The byproducts that free chlorine generates are going to be different if you use a different oxidant. And so there's a whole lot of things, like you said, are kind of, it's almost like you're reinventing the whole industry again, and people have to kind of go back to the drawing board. But it's interesting that hopefully you get some good results from that. So tell me about kind of where you guys stand now. You're in product testing mode. Where does the company stand?
So we have developed a new thin film composite based on our patented sulfonated polysulfones. And this material, so we've created a roll-to-roll process for manufacturing this. We can manufacture in-house on our equipment to create it's a pilot scale roll-to-roll machine. So we can create a 12-inch wide membrane sheet. So we make tens of meters at a time right now. And then we can use those. We are using those to do flat sheet testing currently, but we're also beginning to make some prototype membranes. So we've made some 1812 size membranes, which are the size typically used in a home system and under the sink system. Now those are typically only used at very low pressures that are typical in a residential situation. But we have created a system that we can put our 1812s in them, and we can run them at high pressure, more consistent with the way a larger system would be run with larger membranes that are typically done on a commercial basis. And so we're at the point where we're developing the test data to validate the use of these membranes in a system. Because our next stage will be to scale up to the 40-inch wide web and create the commercial scale membranes, 4040s and 8040s, that we can use in some pilot systems. So to get into the skid at OCWD, as well as OCWD is a really interesting group. They've got a pretty strong R&D group, and they're not just your regular municipal water system utility people. They've got a nice R&D system, and they're really innovators in potable reuse and around the world. And I think they're, probably a comparable entity would be PUB in Singapore, the Public
Sure.
Utilities Board there. They're also innovators in potable reuse and so it's, we're trying to work with these people that are innovators, that have the ability to do research, that, can explore these opportunities. I mean, these are, when I call them innovators, they're leaders. They're developing processes that are being adopted by other people around the world. And so these are the people that we're working with to establish this new technology and the opportunities that this new technology can bring.
And I think these monitoring systems are going to be needed too, because things happen rapidly, and if you don't know what you're doing, it's a little bit hard to make progress. So I didn't realize you all were doing it, but I know some other people are too. And I do think these online monitoring systems are going to be critical to getting these new systems to work, because they are different.
Right, we're working on a system that exposes the water to electromagnetic radiation, LEDs, and generates a native fluorescence response. And we can read that response and determine, basically not quite speciate, but at least tell what kind of chemical compounds are emitting that fluorescence, and being able to make some value judgment about what's going on. And so it's a very interesting process. Still early stage, we're literally in the point of trying to prove it out that it works. Matter of fact, I keep getting texts on my phone from my person out at the site, who wants to talk to me. Something's going on, but they can wait. But you know how research is, like, something either really bad happened or something really good happened. I don't know which one. I turned the phone over. I'm not even going to look at it right now. So yeah, it's really interesting. So how have you guys been? Have you found it trying to generate funding for the company in the mode that you're in now? How has that gone for you guys?
So we have we have gotten some research grants we started out the company with the National Science Foundation SBIR grant, and so we were awarded the phase 1 to establish the proof of concept for could we use these polymers as a membrane, and we did that successfully. We're awarded a phase 2 as well. But the way these SBIR grants work, I don't know if you're familiar, there's a delay between when you apply and when they give you the money. And so there was a 10-month delay between the phase 1 and the phase 2. We had employees at that point, so we had to go raise some money. And so yeah, we had to raise some equity investments. And we've kind of kept that balance. One of the things we were really strong on when we started was, yes, we want to get this SBIR grant. We want to get, as much non-dilutive funding as we can get. But what we don't want to do is chase a bunch of grants where we have to do work that's not important to commercializing this product. We are just laser focused on getting this product in the market and commercializing it, at least to an extent where there is an industry pull for it. There's market pull. And so that's really our goal. And so in terms of grant funding, we've always been really, really particular about applying for grants that fit within what we're doing, so that they're supporting us rather than we're supporting them. That's not the plan here. So yeah, we've raised I think a little over $5 million now, between equity and grants, and we're trying to keep that, keep the funding balance, in terms of investment. We're not running a fancy shop here. We're all working hard, and we do a lot with a little, and we've made just a huge amount of progress in just 4 years or so of really in the weeds. Judy retired from Virginia Tech and came back and has been working in the lab. She does titrations and measures samples and does whatever needs to get done, around, writing patents and writing proposals and reports and all of that. So, she's got a great team out there But yeah, she's really in the thick of it. And that was, when we started the company, we knew that, technical was super important, but business was important too. And so we kind of split it up, and she took the technical and I took the business. And so, we've both grown a lot in the process, I think. I certainly have, as a technical founder, learning the business and all of the things that are necessary to get a startup up and running, keep it running, and start growing it and developing it into a company that's worth acquiring. Then that's what we're headed for.
So what's
I think that
go ahead.
I think that one advantage we've had is that there's two of us.
Mhm.
And we could sort of split that up. And I think some startups, if they start up really small, they try to have one person do both, and it doesn't work. You can't do that. It's too much for one person, almost always. So I think an advantage has been there's two of us.
Mhm.
I would agree with that. I asked the question of most of my guests, if they were a business person, did they start up with a technical person as a partner and vice versa? And most of the ones that seem to have had some success always had a partner that, would be the yin to the yang. And that always kind of worked out the best. So what's the gestation period for your commercial product? When do you think you'd have something?
We are targeting having a commercial minimum viable product, or MVP as it's known, by the end of 2024. And so that will be one that we can, take to places like Orange County Water, that we can take to places with customers that would like to do pilot tests, to understand how they could use this membrane in their application. So that will be very early days. Production will be happening at contract manufacturing. And so we'll be using that process to get products to that scale, because that's really the key to validating it, is getting it in the hands of customers. And we've done that now with membrane sheet, and soon we'll be doing that with 1812s. But the real proof of the pudding is getting the 80/40 out there and demonstrating that can work, and makes all the difference we think it will.
Great. Well, this was a very interesting conversation. Really liked meeting you guys, and wish you all the best of luck. Hope everything goes well for you. And again, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks very much,
Thank
Paul. It was
you.
nice to meet you.
Enjoyed it.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
All right, thanks. Bye.